Hello, and welcome to the Wild Hearts Business for Good podcast. My guest today is a leader from Nestlé, the world's largest food and beverage company. Robin Sundaram is the Sustainable Sourcing Manager at Nestlé UK, where, amongst his many responsibilities, Robin is responsible for developing and implementing Nestlé's procurement for good strategy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Robin. To help our listeners get to know you better, can you tell us a bit about yourself? What path did you take to get where you are today?
Hi, Mick. Thanks for inviting me along. Okay, about myself. I'm Robin Sundaram. I'm married to my wife Helen. I have two children, two lovely children. Charlie, who's 13 years old, and Kitty, who's 10. They're both, as we record this, we're in the middle of still COVID, and they're both homeschooling at the moment, which has its challenges, as a lot of people are finding, but on the whole, they're coping very well. I live down on the south coast in Lewis, which is a small town just near Brighton, 5 miles from Brighton, and we're surrounded by the lovely the downs around here, so it gives us opportunity to get out of the house and do a bit of walking in the downs. Not that the kids particularly enjoy that, but we drag them out. You asked Mick, what path did I take to get where I am today? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I left university in the late 80s, showing my age a little bit, and uh, at the time, the big accountancy firms actually were coming onto campus, trying to get as many people as possible into accountancy. And I'd done a degree in economics at Leicester University, and I did what a lot of people did: is I ended up at Price Waterhouse in London in the late 80s when there was a lot of money flowing, and I found myself in that world in London where back then, it's unheard of now, I think, but back then you'd go for drinks at lunchtime and sometimes on Friday afternoons. Sometimes on Friday afternoons you wouldn't return to work, but I found what I found actually was that it wasn't something that I found particularly interesting or exciting. And what I really wanted to do was get a proper management experience. So, to cut a long story short, I ended up leaving Pricewaterhouse to go to Marks and Spencer, but my timing wasn't great. It was the early '90s, recession was hitting, and I had the first kind of big setback of my life, which was I got made redundant after only 4 months of being at Marks and Spencer's. Black Monday, we called it, because there were 800 odd people got made redundant on that day. And uh, but one thing I did learn actually is, I mean, I've always still liked Marks and Spencer, and one of the reasons for that is that they went to a lot of effort to give us counselling support in terms of trying to find new jobs, and it was my first kind of inclination, sort of idea of how a business can still be a force for good, even when they're actually making decisions that may not feel right at the time. But they had to do it for economic reasons. I understood that. Yeah, so I ended up going to Safeway. Spent 5 years at Safeway, which was my first kind of introduction into the food industry. And one of my suppliers at the time was actually Nestle. And Nestle, uh, I didn't feel were a particularly good supplier in terms of actually being able to supply product from a customer service perspective. So I ended up making the move into Nestle because I thought I could help from a customer service perspective. And I've now spent this is now my 25th year at the company. Enjoyed it thoroughly. Had lots and lots of different roles throughout what we call the farm to fork. So I've spent a lot of time working with our customers like Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, and a number of others. I've worked in sales, in and but predominantly in supply chain. And for the last 7 years, I've been within procurement and now a sustainable sourcing manager for the last 3 or 4 years. So that's a bit of a whistle stop tour as to how I got to where I am today.
I have this image of you drinking at lunchtime. It just, I just got this image of the 80s, all this fashion. So I'm kind of picturing you like that, which is quite amusing, Robin, I must admit. Um, we're going to cover a lot of the really exciting initiatives and very challenging initiatives that you're heading up in Nestle and Nestle wider. If we can just stick with you at the start of our chat, One thing that I always love to ask leaders in business is in what way their upbringing, and you and I have chatted about this a lot before, in what way your upbringing and personal values influence how you approach your role. Because so often people see a title, a big brand and a big title, and they don't really see the human behind that. And I'm really keen for that to come out in our chat. So, in what way has your upbringing affected your values and how you approach your role professionally?
Okay, I mean, I think my upbringing has had a massive impact on how I approach life in general, really, and my work. So, my dad, I was born in Sri Lanka back in 1966, and my dad came over to the UK. He did various jobs. He was a fisherman, and he was studying to do law actually, and he decided that he wanted to come to the
He was a
UK
fisherman in Sri Lanka or a fisherman in the
in Sri
UK?
Lanka.
I'm
Yes.
just thinking. I think I've got some friends, family in the past that were fishermen, but that was in the North Sea. So I think he had a much nicer time of it in Sri Lanka than the North Sea, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think he probably had a more tropical version of fishing. But he also was studying for law, and I think he had a job in the local post office or something. But he had a bit of a wanderlust, so he decided to come over. When I was only 6 months old, he came over. He found very quickly how difficult it was being an immigrant in Sri Lanka, from Sri Lanka in the 60s. But it was a time when the government was inviting people from the Commonwealth over. So it was relatively easy to get jobs, but not easy to go to university. So he abandoned his law ideas and got a job in at British Gas actually, and then he got he arranged for my mum and I to come over. So I was 10 months old when we came to the UK, and I've got three younger brothers now, and we my main memories of growing up actually were our house was we grew up in Wimbledon, and our house was always full. There was always a lot of noise. There were always people around. And one of the things that he taught us all is that how you've really got to look out for other people. So even though it was a small house, we were all squashed in together. He always made sure that one of our bedrooms was available for students from Sri Lanka, and so when they
Wow.
came over, he would let them stay in the house. So we always had, and there would be two of them in the room, quite squashed in together. But because he was one of the first Sri Lankan Tamils to come over, he um, he knew how things worked. He would write letters for people when they came over to help get them jobs, or if they had to anything really, he would sort of help them through that process. And so I was sort of seeing that as I grew up. He also was quite. I guess he was quite different for the times in that he was always helping out around the house. He was the main cook actually, and well, I say main cook. My mum cooked a lot as well. My dad was I guess the chef when the good meals had to be done. And also, I mean, my mum at the time, my mum's was bipolar. We didn't really know back then because it wasn't talked about, but
Uh,
she had significant mental health issues, and once in a while, she would she would just suddenly disappear, and we'd be like, "Oh, where's mum gone?" And my dad would say, "Oh, yeah, she's in hospital," and so we'd go and visit her in hospital. And back then, it was when they used to do the electric shock therapy as well. So we'd turn up and she'd be just like, if you've seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it was very much like that. And so that was our first, I guess, indication as me and my brothers of mental health and the impact of that it has on on families. And yeah, so my dad was kind of managing, four sons, a wife that was had these challenges, and also trying to juggle a job and also look after these students that were coming over. So that kind of, I guess, I was sort of grew up with that going on, and then really, I think that was the biggest eye opener of everything really was the civil war kicked off in Sri Lanka in 1983, and my dad had five sisters. My mum had one brother and sorry, two brothers and one sister, but they'd already left Sri Lanka. Whereas all of my dad's sisters they all lived in the same village, and they all actually lived in the same road. It was called Kurumba City Road, and the army came in and one day just basically bombed a whole load of houses, and a number of our houses got bombed. Fortunately, none of our relatives were killed, but
Mhm.
the army just took over the whole village, and to this day, they still have half the village. So our house that we grew up in, I was fortunate enough to go back about 3 or 4 years ago back to the village, but our house is completely overgrown. It's like if you've watched the what was it, the Lara Croft film with Angelina Jolie, when she's in Cambodia in Angkor Wat, and you see all these
Uh-huh.
ruins covered in trees. That's what our house was like. You could not see the house for the trees and all the vegetation around it. But what my dad did was one by one, even though he didn't have much money, he brought over my cousins to the UK, and they're all quite young. The youngest was 13 at the time. The oldest, I think, was 19 or 20. He brought over 8 or 9 of them, and put them into schools. And but then when they started to work, because they didn't really speak English and they were really struggling with the cultural change. Um, they went into jobs working in petrol stations, in as cleaners, real kind of low-level jobs. And I saw them. They started to get to find wives and husbands. They started to have children, my cousins, and they would. I was seeing this happen in front of my eyes. They were working day and night. They didn't really have social lives, but they basically used all their money to get extra tuition for their children. And what's really amazing now is that all of their children, pretty much. Have all started going to university, really started to get really good careers as doctors, accountants. The kinds of careers that we were told when we were growing up that we should try and aspire to.
Mhm.
That my cousins' children are now doing that. So I guess in a roundabout way, what I'm trying to say is that a number of those things that I grew up with, whether it be the mental health issues of my mum or the importance of looking after other people, and also equality and the importance of equalities. And I grew up in the 80s when the National Front and the BNP were at their height. I remember being chased down the street by skinheads and being abused and all the rest. And so I always grew up with this feeling of equality and the importance of equality, and whether it be your gender, your sexual orientation, your race, your culture, your religion, shouldn't matter. We're all human beings at the end of the day, all trying to strive, do our best for ourselves and for our children, and that has always been top of mind when I carry out sort of my job. And so, being sustainable sourcing manager means that I can really work hard to try and make sure that our sustainability sourcing policies and working with our suppliers, we try and reflect the importance of equality, in particular social equality and social mobility, in what we do.
Wow. I mean, I thought I knew you, Robin, but I mean, that story is there's so many um, things we could take from that. I mean, upon reflecting on that Britain's the immigrant story in Britain is incredible. You know what the original immigrants, especially from the Caribbean and Southern Asia, etc., what they went through, and you reminded me of there's one of the Wild Hearts schools in Wimbledon, funnily enough,
Oh, really?
and yeah, and these kids are from every country you could imagine. You know, vast majority of them are BAME kids, and this school is remarkable. And one thing that you said, it was one of the parents when I did a speech there said, if you're a refugee or if you're an immigrant, the one thing that you know will help your kid escape what you went through is education.
Yes.
Um, and that's why you and I share that passion. That's why you're on I imagine, our national advisory board for schools. It is the vehicle for transformation for anybody.
It's
Sorry, there's just so many things we could take from that, and
Yeah.
you've kind of ruined all my questions, Robin, because I had so many questions I wanted to ask you. Now we could go into do a deep dive into everything you just covered there. Um, the Let me come to this then. There's, I think, one thing that is a theme that runs through so many of your experiences, and very grateful to you for opening up with that, is the level of empathy you must have experienced. Like, what is it like to suffer from a mental health issue? What is it like for the family? What is it like being the underdog? What's it like being the outsider? There's so many points there. Um, in your own experience in your career, how did that help you deal with setbacks and failures in a professional setting? Um, there were a lot of character building experiences there. How could you draw on them when maybe you've faced your own setbacks in a
Um,
professional sense?
yeah, I guess a couple of things come to mind. Firstly, is that I've just learnt. Uh, I think I've learned to be quite tenacious. And so when I do get knockbacks or things don't quite go my way, it's trying to find a different approach. And I think it was Oprah Winfrey actually who said that something along the lines of there's no such thing as failure. It's just life telling you to approach the situation in a different way, or try and find a different approach. Uh, and um, and I remember quite early on in my career when I was at Safeway. I think I touched on it. I remember I was my job at the time. It was I'd just been made redundant from M&S. If I'm honest, I took this job just because I really needed a job,
Mm.
and I was ordering a stock from our suppliers, and one of our suppliers failed to deliver, and what you're meant to do is try and get a rebooking or whatever it was. And I remember I was just thinking, oh, this is too hard. There's no way they're going to be able to redeliver within the next day or so. I remember my boss saying to me, well, why are we out of stock? What have you done about it? And I said, oh, I've spoken to them. I think it was a bit of a white lie, and said they can't do it. And he just rang them up and said, look, can you do it for us tomorrow? And they said, yes, we can. And I remember being embarrassed, but he did it in front of the rest of the team. And I remember thinking, um, I'm never going to be in this situation ever again where I haven't tried everything I can to fix the problem, because he showed me
Mhm.
you can. But I also remember learning a vital lesson about management or leadership, is that you do not embarrass other people, or, make them look small. So there was a couple of very quick things I learned early on in my career, which I've always kind of maintained. And I've always, it's one of those things about, if you're going to be a leader, and you want people to follow you, one of the worst thing you can do is make someone look small,
Mm.
and belittle them in some way. Another thing that it's not, I guess, it's not quite a failure, but one thing that happened when I took this role as sustainable sourcing manager is my boss at the time, I mean, I hadn't done anything like this, and he was convinced that I could do a good job in the role, so he gave it to me. And I remember mutterings at the time from other people within procurement who'd been in procurement for many years, basically along the lines of, "Oh, why has he chosen Robin to do this? He'll never do a good job of it." And one of the things I had to do at first was work with our dairy cooperative that we buy fresh milk from, and we'd spent years and years. The previous boss before this one and my predecessors had spent 10 years trying to get this supplier to open up about the costings and but and really just to work more closely with us, more collaboratively. And this supplier uh, wasn't doing that. There was really zero trust in the relationship. And one thing that I'm very proud of is that within 6 months of taking on this role, not only did we have a much more open relationship, but they just opened up with all their costings, something that we'd
Really?
spent 10 years trying to do, and I'd managed it within 6 months.
But how did
And
you do
pure,
that, Robin? You're making it sound like I'd managed it in 6 months.
it,
What did you do differently?
it just comes down to treating people as people, and ultimately it's very easy to treat businesses people or treat everyone in a business as one, lump them all together. You are just
Mm.
one faceless company, or to just try and just we're looking for cost savings. It was traditional procurement, and I'm sure we'll get on to what procurement should look like in the future, at least from my perspective. But it was very traditional, old school procurement. You bash your supplier over the head. You don't develop any relationships. You don't develop that because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're all trying our best, and it's just finding that middle ground, and that's what I was able to do. Really, is to find that middle ground, meet them, and treat them with respect.
You
Ultimately,
remind me of something that, sorry, one of my mentors said to me before. He says, everybody thinks they're dealing with a company, these large global brands especially. He says, you're not, you're dealing with a person. These companies are made up of people. That's the power of culture, though, isn't it? That do people have permission to feel they can act in a certain way or treat people the way you're talking about? Coming on to procurement, Nestle have done a lot of work on social responsibility in your supply chain, areas such as food waste, food security, sustainable food practices. I think I'm fascinated to understand, coming from your personal values, you talk about you're obviously driven by very deeply held values. These areas that we're going to come on to are manifestations of how we're going to address major global problems. Can you tell us more about these initiatives and how you see your role in expanding them in the future?
yeah. I mean, we have some significant challenges globally, and one thing that's very, very clear is one business on their own cannot make a massive difference. So I think the first thing that we all need to understand, and Nestle really understands, is that the importance of collaboration. So this is about we need to collaborate with suppliers, all the way through back to our farmers that grow the ingredients to make our products. But we have to collaborate with people in civil society. We have to collaborate with all the NGOs that are out there. We have to collaborate with governments, with our customers, and that's that could be retail customers, it could be our out of home customers, and ultimately with our consumers as well. So these big challenges that we have, it is about collaboration. The other key thing I think more and more important is transparency. We can't, again, it's very, very easy to see the big organizations as being these big black boxes that something there are the dark arts going on within
Mm.
there, and ultimately they are just, these companies are trying to make as much money as they can at the expense of people and the planet, and that's not the case. I mean, what we what we are looking to do is there's currently 7.5 billion people on the planet. There are going to be 10.5, maybe 11 billion by 2050. They need to be fed, and currently 54% of the people in the world live in cities. The prediction is that by 2050, 75% of the population will be living in cities. We won't all be able to grow our own food, so there is a requirement for companies like Nestle who provide packaged, product food, both for animals and for human beings, to exist. So what we need to do is we need to be able to manage this huge requirement to be fed, but in a way that allows us to not have any negative impact on the planet, and to do it in a way that ultimately actually actively helps people as well, whether that's be the social conditions within which they work, um, or economically as well, to be able to make a living for themselves and for their families. Those are the big challenges that we have, and I can come on to a number of things that we're doing to try and
Well,
address
yeah,
those
could you give us
challenges.
some examples? Because, I mean, obviously, the the scale of the challenge is vast. And in our conversations in the past, you've given me a real insight into how one decision, well-intentioned decision, can have an impact, completely unintended impact elsewhere. And also, there's so many areas, whether it's reducing carbon emissions or environmental degradation or plastic waste. Could you touch on how you prioritize your strategy? And secondly, some specific examples of things that you're doing, but also the challenges involved in that. Would you mind? chatting us through that?
Yeah, I can. There's a lot, but I'll try and do it in a way that's relatively structured if I can. So, I mean, the biggest challenge is climate change and the human impact on that. We know it's happening. We're all experiencing it right now. So, we as a company have made a commitment that by 2050 we will be net zero as a business in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's we buy 1% of the world's agricultural output. So we have a huge environmental footprint. Agriculture is the number one cause of these greenhouse gases. There's also agriculture is responsible for a significant amount of water usage as well, and the amount of land that goes into agriculture is significant. So we've got made this commitment about 2050, but in reality, to be able to achieve to achieve that, we have to look at our entire farm to fork. And actually, what's within our direct control through our operations, through our factories and offices, is only about 5% of that impact. So we have to work with our supply base all the way back to farmers, and we have to work at the other end as well with consumption. So every time you have a Nescafe and you boil your kettle, that has an impact on our environmental footprint. So
Hmm.
working end to end. So that's I guess, our biggest commitment, and our number one focus is how can we achieve that. And I can come on to the key things that we need to do around that. But the second is the highest profile at the moment probably is plastics and packaging. So
Hmm.
again, we've made a commitment that by 2025, all of our packaging will be reusable or recyclable. Now, that is a massive task. We are the world's biggest food and drink company. We have operations in over 80 countries. We're actually selling products in something like 187 countries around the world. So there's clearly a huge amount of packaging that goes into our product. But even if we were to achieve that, say, even if we did it next year, all of our packaging is recyclable or reusable. The reality is that you will still see our products among as well as other companies' products on the beaches, in rivers. So getting to 100% isn't enough, and so we have to find ways, and we are working on ways um, to make sure that the overall issue is looked at. So, firstly, we have to work with local councils and local government in terms of how do we make it easier for consumers to actually recycle their products. So, curbside recycling, because we've got 390 or 400 or so councils, all do it slightly differently. So, how can we help to with to do that? But secondly, in this country, we also we don't actually recycle everything within the UK. We don't have the processing capability to do that, and actually two-thirds of it gets sent overseas. So again, how can we as Nestle help to invest in the infrastructure that we have in the UK to improve the actual recycling capability within the UK? So that's work that we're doing. And then thirdly, even once you can recycle it, how much of it can we then reuse? So, for instance, our Buxton bottles have got recycled. They're made from recycled bottles, but that capability again isn't huge in the UK, and we need to invest. And therefore, again, we are doing things. We're working on an initiative up in Scotland exactly on this. So, how can we invest back into enabling this recycling so that we have this ultimately you'll have heard the term the circular economy. So how can we
Mm.
really focus on this circular economy? And then finally, it's about education really and labeling. So how can we really make sure that our products have got really clear labeling about what can and can't be recycled, and ultimately
Hmm.
all of it will be recyclable. But also, how can we educate people, because currently still too much that can be recycled isn't recycled. So they're the big two things I'd say: carbon and plastics and packaging at the moment, but there's a huge amount to be done in terms of our responsible sourcing program, which looks at human rights within our supply chain. It looks at health and safety in our supply chain all the way back up. It looks at animal welfare and making sure that animal standards are at the highest levels possible all the time.
Mhm.
And it looks at what we call business integrity. So there's no corruption, bribery. The local laws of every country are adhered to. So there's a number of different elements to our responsible sourcing program, and this is where we get into this grey, because it's very, very easy to see things in very black and white terms, but in reality, life is just lots of shades of grey, and we really see this in our responsible sourcing program.
But, but Robin, one thing that struck me, the sheer scale of the task that you're taking on. I mean, to just go back to one point you made, if you're saying you want to be net zero by 2050, but only 5% of your carbon footprint is your own offices and Nestle's own infrastructure, are you saying that 95% of the people you need to influence are basically not our suppliers to Nestle, but are not under Nestle's direct control? And many might be in different countries where you may not have that extent, the influence that you would need to make change. How do you influence farmers and producers across multiple cultures and police that and make that happen? That's a daunting task.
It is. It's a huge challenge, and and this goes back to my point about it. It's all about collaboration, but it's also about having data. So it needs to be science based, what you do. So there's at the moment, there are a number of different ways to measure carbon, the ways to understand, because a lot of people don't realize, but there's actually more carbon in the ground than in the air. So our farming practices. Over the last 30, 40 years, as we've become more intensive in the way that we farm, we've actually accelerated the release of that carbon, and we're degrading the soil so much that the organic structure of the soils is depleted, which again has significant issues. So we're dependent on our farmers, and in fact, that's where the biggest opportunity is our farmers around the world. So I guess to answer your question, we have to find ways to incentivize our farmer base to change their sort of production methods, but it needs to work for farmers themselves. It needs to work ultimately, because it's got to work for them economically. It's got to work for them in terms of ease of implementation. So we work with our suppliers to help deliver that. We work with academics to help pull together the proof, the scientific proof of what works and doesn't work. But we have to work with governments as well, because you've got, in some countries, governments have got active policies around farming and environment and food, and in other countries not so much. But you need governmental support as well, and clearly working with our NGOs and our partners as well. So it's everyone kind of working together, and um, to achieve that. And there are there are tensions within that. So for instance, if I come back to sort of from a procurement perspective, I mean, one of the things that is important when you're a procurement professional is you need to make sure that I mean, a lot of people think it's all about savings. Yes, savings are important, but ultimately we're here to ensure supply and mitigate risk. They're the key things from a procurement perspective you need to deliver. And so to ensure supply to your factories, you need to be able uh, to make sure that your suppliers don't, if they were to go out of business, God forbid, or that you're able to switch supply quickly. So you
Hmm.
can't have all of your eggs in one basket.
Hmm.
But the negative of that is, if you want to develop long term, you really want to develop a long term partnership with, say, a farming cooperative, or to be able to implement sustainable farming practices, you can't switch supply constantly, because they won't have the trust in Nestle. That we're there in it for the long
Hmm.
term. Similarly, when we've got to try and develop packaging solutions, that needs a huge amount of innovation. But if you're a supplier to Nestle, you need to have some sort of long-term commitment again, that we're not
Hmm.
suddenly going to walk away, or you know because that supplier is going to have to invest. So we've got this tension always between not having all our eggs in one basket, as I said, being able to switch supply if we need to from a mitigating risk perspective, but at the same time we need to be able to have these strategic longer term partnerships to really develop long term sustainable solutions to some of these big challenges that we have. So this tension is always there within procurement, and we're having to find ways to solve that.
It's interesting when I've discussed the global goals, UN global goals, on many occasions, and overwhelmingly what I can hear you saying through these examples is 17 collaboration and partnerships, that these issues are so multifaceted and reach into so many different areas of different geographic areas and different areas of jurisdiction. And to think one business or one person, one government can change it alone is deluded. Um, Again, you were touching on the global scale of dealing with people in different cultures and dealing with farmers in different areas, and then even coming back to if you're going to make your plastic packaging reusable and recyclable, it even comes down to bins in England and
Yes,
council policies, etc. I
yes,
think one thing I'd really appreciate, I think our listeners would really appreciate, Robin, if you're working on a in both the micro and the macro level, and you've outlined the scale of the problems and the challenges that you face. It'd be really helpful, I think, if maybe you could give us an example, just a little mini case study, if you will, of what that can look like. And I think your shared value, creating shared value prize is a good example, because that gives you a chance to work with social enterprises focused on nutrition and water and rural development. Is there any social enterprise examples you could give us of how you've integrated it into your business model, or how you've worked with a social enterprise to help bring your strategies or your goals to life?
yeah. Am I allowed to talk about Wild Hearts or?
I'd love you
Yeah,
to. Of
that's
course.
because you're the first social enterprise that we're actually have actively started to work with.
And can I just say that that question was not set up for you to talk about Wild Hearts, in case anybody's rolling their eyes and thinking of me.
Well, I think, I mean, going back to the broader pictures, something that has underpinned the way that Nestle has worked for many, many years is this idea of creating shared value. And,
Mhm.
and what that means is that we can create value for our shareholders. And ultimately, we are a company that has shareholders, and we have to create value for our shareholders. And we've been around for 154 years. So we've done a good job of doing that. But one of the reasons we've been able to do that and be around for such a long time is that the second half of that is we believe we can create value for society at the same time. And for a company to really prosper long term, you have to be able to do both. And I think just the simple fact that we've been around for such a long time shows that we have been able to do that. But creating value for society, and what does that look like? And that's a number of things. But importantly, it's being able to create social value. Uh, it's ultimately it's about people still at the end of the day, and so we've done a lot in terms of, I talked about a responsive sourcing program. So an example would be our cocoa sourcing in Ivory Coast in Ghana. I mean, we started working with the Fair Labour Association a few years ago. We
Mhm.
asked them to come in and look at uh, what goes on in Ivory Coast and Ghana, with an understanding that actually, we know children work on some of these farms and plantations. They have done for many, many years. And what this was allowed us to do, firstly, was to be able to understand the scale of the issue. Secondly, is really start to work with our suppliers, with the support of the Fair Labour Association, to understand, well, what can we do to ultimately stop this issue? And it comes down to poverty. All of the underlying most of this is poverty. So what can you do as a company? And you can work with a number of NGOs, and you can pay a premium, and we do to try and support support the farmers. But we've tried to go a step further and say, well, how can you help the community as well as individual farmers? So we've built schools to try and get, and we've built something like 50 schools to try and get children into the schools. But what you start to realize more and more, and this is back to my point about the different sort of shades of grey, and things aren't black and white, is that isn't necessarily a solution on its own. So when you start to dig deeper, you start to realize actually, well, some children still aren't going to school. So why is that? We've built the schools, and then you start to realize, well, some of them don't have birth certificates to prove how old they are, and this is a bit of a challenge. So in some areas, and we found actually with the Nescafe plan in Kenya that that these children are going to school, but they're not doing particularly well, and that's because they're hungry. So then you've got to take another look, and you've got to dig deeper. And what we identified actually is that some of these farmers are don't know necessarily what food to grow and to cook to be able to give their families the right kind of nutritional support, and so then we started training some of our farmers on how can you grow the right herbs, spices, vegetables in your gardens, on your farm, to be able to cook the right foods. We've actually been able to help some of them to actually learn to cook, and this isn't just about the women, this is the men as well, teaching them to cook. So when you start to dig deeper, you start to realize that one solution isn't the right solution for all, and that may seem obvious, but it's only when you dig deep. And so we as a business are starting to move more towards really understanding the impact of what we do. So yes, we do. One of the things we've seen a great increase throughout the world. The world is responsible sourcing audits and making sure that compliance, yes, is important, but
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to go beyond compliance to really starting to understand what is the impact of our policies, and what can we actively do on the ground.
I think that's one of the things that fascinates me about the power of procurement professionals. There was a fantastic article in Forbes magazine featuring Johnson Johnson, and actually we're using Wild Hearts as a case study, which I was very proud of. And the headline was, "Will the chief procurement officer become the chief purpose officer?" Um, where you spend your money is ultimately where you demonstrate your value. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So so often people, well-meaning people, would go into a village, such as the example you cited, and want to make a difference, but only by really getting under the skin of actually why are these issues existing, and that takes long-term commitment. And as you said earlier, one of your values, tenacity, to get to the root. And also, you have to work with the people rather than patronising them, going and trying to do it for them. Um,
Yes.
the
Yes.
power of procurement to make these changes. Consumer demand will be a key part, and also government demands, but also people like you saying, "I want to make this difference, and by working with my customers, I can help bring that to life." That does have the potential to be genuinely transformative.
Yes.
Um, on that note, then, Robin, what do you think are the biggest opportunities and threats that procurement leaders need to be aware of? And you've covered a lot of them, and I think obviously, given that you're in the food industry, you're really at the sharp edge of that. But in a wider sense, what do you think your peers have to be aware of?
Yeah, I love that quote, by the way, that in the future the chief procurement officer is going to be the chief purpose officer, because for me, I think if it feels right, um, but I think my own view is I think many procurement organizations are still a long way from that. I think there's still a very traditional view of procurement,
Mm,
and even within our own organization as well, there's various levels of engagement across that. And that's not to say that traditional procurement isn't right, because it is, because it's always delivered in terms of going back to my earlier points about savings. It's important for, procurement there ultimately are there to find the savings, but also ensuring supply, mitigate risk, ensure we have the right quality of product that we're coming in, so that we make the best products available. Because our purpose within um, uh, within Nestlé from procurement perspective uh, is to deliver the best to Nestlé so that Nestlé can deliver the best to our consumers. And so a lot of the traditional elements are important. But what I guess a threat stroke opportunity is that you can still save money, but you can be much more efficient in the way that you do it, and you can still deliver value to the business, but in a way that brings social, economic, environmental uh, value as well. So, and I think this is the big opportunity. For procurement is to look at all the challenges that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I think, capture very well globally. They may not all be relevant to that procurement organization, but a number of them will be. And it's to really face into that and say, well, what can we do around climate change? Well, actually, to focus on regenerative agriculture, if I give Nestle as an example, you focus on regenerative agriculture, you start from you go from, I think, where a lot of businesses have been is about that. Well, let's try and do no harm is the approach, that the traditional approach to CSR, and start to flip it into, well, how can we do good? Yeah, so start to take this different mindset. So regenerative agriculture is all about that, but ultimately the benefits are huge because by doing that, you actually you start to improve the quality of your soils and the organic matter, which then starts to reduce the carbon impact that you have. You starts to make you more resilient to climate change. So actually, you start to deliver the other things that procurement's all about, which is security of supply. You start to improve the security of your supply by implementing those practices, but at the same time, you're starting to help the planet a lot more. So that's one example. But the other big one, or one of the big ones of many, is this idea of helping society through things like working with social enterprises. And this is where our relationship with Wild Hearts, I think, is an incredible example of a win-win-win all around, because we are by reimagining our procurement spend and starting to buy our office supplies from Wild Hearts, we're getting office supplies that at the moment 80% of those supplies now um, uh, are made from recycled material or can be reused or recycled, which is a massive increase on the office supplies that we had previously.
Mm-hmm.
So we're already starting to have an environmental impact. But at the same time, Wild Hearts, we know that by buying from Wild Hearts, we're impacting and helping to transform lives all around the world, whether it be the micro Tyco in the UK or through the starter program and the uh, microloans that we do to women in the developing world. So we know we're making an impact from a social perspective, but also in terms of employee engagement. People in our business feel good about the fact that we can, through procurement, just changing our spend, we're making a positive impact in communities. And what that also allows us to do is not only do we increase our engagement, but we're going to increase retention of people within the business. And importantly, it's going to enable us to employ the right people going forward as well. And we all know that particularly younger people coming through, this is really, really important to them.
Mm.
And rightly so, this is their future we're talking about. So all of this, there are so many win-wins from that. Just working with Wild Hearts and working with other social enterprises, and there are many there. And it's one of the things that I'm really keen that we find ways to accelerate. But having said that, we have to make sure that it's right for us as a business. So we need to make sure that that social enterprise is able to still achieve all of the things that our consumers expect. So the right quality, that they're able to supply service levels that we expect. So all of the things that our consumers would expect, that social enterprise still needs to be able to deliver as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why Wild Hearts strapline is business for good. In business has to compete on its own merits and deliver, and that is a challenge for social enterprise to deliver that impact, but still be able to compete on a level playing field with other players. You know, interesting. You made a very good point there, Robin. One stat that I find very inspirational is that by 2025, 75% of the world's workforce will want to work for a company that creates positive social impact and wider impact in the world. And I think it's fascinating. And sometimes it's getting much rarer now, but you come across maybe some procurement people that are a wee bit old school and that it's only price, whereas they're missing the wider value. So in terms of inspiring customers, attracting top talent, retaining talent, staff engagement, if the company doesn't have a wider, credible social vision, social impact, they're going to be hemorrhaging money through recruitment costs, staff retention, staff attrition, etc. That they're
Yes.
not, but they're only focusing on the price of one thing rather than the holistic approach of their business. I think it's fascinating, and one thing I find very inspirational is that you are seeing all the opportunities for positive change that procurement professionals can deliver, rather than saying, "Oh God, I've got to comply with all these new demands on my role." It's a great opportunity to expand your role and make a real, credible, lasting difference. On that theme, then, and I could talk to you all day, Robin. The the last question then, and you've touched on it, but if someone's listening to you, and I know there'll be so many people listening to you who have been really moved and inspired, and I know I have been, and I'm very grateful to you for the opening up to us today. What advice would you give to a business leader, procurement or otherwise, who want to have a successful career but want to make a positive difference? What takeaways could they have from today to help them?
Okay. My advice would be, firstly, is to answer your question around achieving a good career in procurement, but also having that social impact, is that there are really good examples of procurement delivering social impact out there. Really good examples. So I would say look externally, find those examples, um, and then start to think about, well, how can I potentially look to deliver something like that in my organization. I think secondly is sometimes there are procurement professionals or procurement teams that are they're just one small element of a business where they kind of sit on their own in the corner. People kind of go, well, what do those guys do over there? Oh, yeah, they save us money. Yeah, great. I would say you've got to be an integral part of your organization, and you've got to find a way to do that. And everyone in the organization is open to procurement, because the first thing they think is, oh, this team is going to help deliver some savings, bring us some money. Great. So they want to talk to you. So there is an open door already for, but but then that gives you a great opportunity to go in and say, you know what, we can do this, but actually, we can deliver the things that you want. We can save you some money. We can ensure that you get supplied to the factory, or I'm talking about FMCG here. It'll be different in different organizations, different industries. But ultimately, you know what? We can do this. We can help drive our business for good strategy. Yeah, we can help really make an impact in the communities that we have. And this is by working with this social enterprise or that social enterprise. We can help drive, help some resiliency as a business to climate change by really working with these farmers to help implement these practices. We can, all of these different things that procurement can deliver that we've talked about. It's just really being able to bring that alive in a way to the stakeholders in the business. And I think if you can do that, you then become somebody that's an integral part of the organization, as opposed to that person who sits over there in the corner in the procurement team. And you can really show you can add value. So yes, it's procurement is a profession, and you can get a qualification in it, and you can have a really successful career. And I know plenty of people who've done that. But I think if you really want to make an impact from a social perspective and an environmental perspective, then you've got to become an integral part of the wider organization to help the organization as a whole really make a difference, because that's the only way that we're going to really face into these big global challenges that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are there to help us achieve.
That's absolutely fantastic advice, Robin, and one expanded vision of what a procurement leader can be and deliver. Thank you so much for your time, Robin. I'm so, so grateful, one, for the information you've shared and your insights, but also for being so candid and being willing to open up about your own personal experiences and background. I know an awful lot of listeners will take an awful lot away from this today. So thank you so much. I am really looking forward to seeing you face to face once the lockdown's over.
Yeah.
And thanks again for being such a fantastic champion for Wild Hearts. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mick. I really enjoyed that.